Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this edition of MBA Banking Buzz. Thank you to all the bankers for joining us today. I am pleased to have a very special guest with me today, Representative Kristin Robbins. We are going to have a discussion of the work she is doing as chair of the newly created House Fraud Prevention and Oversight Committee. Before we get started, I wanted to give one plug for an upcoming MBA education program. On August 12th, we will be offering our second annual Bankers Conference. This program is designed for all bank managers and leaders. Our MBA Annual Summit is a 3-day conference, primarily for bank CEOs. Not all bankers can attend the summit for various reasons, so we put together a 1-day program with summit quality speakers and networking. Please check out the MBA website for more information on this great program. We think this program will eventually be one of our biggest single-day events. I encourage you to check it out. All right, let's get to it. Welcome, Representative Robbins, and thank you so much for being with us here today. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from originally?
Originally, I'm from Crookston. And then when I was growing up, my parents moved to Upper Michigan. So kind of a combo.
Excellent. Well, welcome back to Minnesota. We're pleased to have you. How did you get started in politics?
You know, I came back here for college. I went to Bethel University and I was a political science major. So that kind of gave me the bug. And after college, I moved to DC and worked on Capitol Hill for a little more than 3 years. So I was a legislative director for a member of Congress from Illinois. And so I got the bug, but then, stayed at home, 3 daughters. It was a wonderful period of my life, but I just volunteered for a lot of people. So when the seat in my district suddenly became open, people knew I knew what to do. So I just decided to go for it.
That's excellent. I went to St. John's, by the way, so got a lucky my conference, right? Absolutely. You represent District 37A, which is west of the Twin Cities, right?
Yes. So it's all of Western Maple Grove, and then all of the cities of Corcoran, Medina, Greenfield, Independence, Loretto, and Maple Plain.
Right. And I know you're an assistant leader in the House Republican Caucus, and you serve on a couple of the big major committees at the legislature. Can you tell us what you do in that leadership role and which of the committees you serve on?
Sure. So I am the chair of the new Fraud Committee, and I'm also the vice chair of Ways and Means, which is sort of the budget setting committee. And then I'm senior on Tax Committee, and I'm also been around on higher ed for 2 terms now. So it's fun.
Yeah, those are some of the biggest committees. There's an awful lot that goes through all of those, especially in the financial side. So yeah, the new House Fraud Prevention and Oversight Committee, that's an interesting animal. Can you tell us how and why that new committee was formed?
Yes, it's a great story. So when we had the November election last year, the House was tied 67-67. But then it was determined that a member of the DFL caucus was not a legal resident of their district.
Right.
So we had a temporary majority of 67-66. And during that time, we negotiated a new power sharing agreement. And so out of that, we got a 2-year Republican speaker, Representative Lisa Demuth, who's been a great speaker. And then we also got, as part of the negotiation, the Fraud Committee. And so there's only one Fraud Committee. The Senate doesn't have a counterpart.
Right.
And it's been just fantastic opportunity to really dig into all the fraud that, everyone sees about in the news, all these stories in different agencies, different programs. And so our mission has been to take a look at that and provide enterprise-wide oversight, because there are individual committees that have looked into different levels of fraud, but no one's been taking a picture at the whole thing in the state government.
Right, and with the House being so balanced this year, a lot of the committees were set up with a 50-50 membership, co-leadership, and that sort of thing. But this one is structured differently. Tell me a little bit about the makeup of this committee and how you're able to establish it the way it was.
Yes, so as part of the negotiated power sharing agreement, all the other committees have co-chairs, Republican and Democrat, and equal membership. So nothing passes out of a regular committee without bipartisan support because everything fails on a tie. In my committee, we have a Republican chair, myself, and then we have a Republican majority, 5-3. So we try to work collegially with our Democrat counterpoint. You know, lead Dave Pinto is the Democrat who's the lead for the Democrats. But, you know, I do get to set the agenda. We determine the witnesses. We determine the order. So that's why I've been able to say fraud committee is going to keep meeting during the interim. Most committees don't meet when we're not in session, but we are going to continue to meet monthly.
Fraud never rests, right?
It never does.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned that there were some pretty high profile type situations here in Minnesota. And you know, there was a lot of news coverage of some of them in particular, but without giving away any secrets of what you're doing, and I know a lot of it's public anyways, but are there some specific frauds that you wanted to tell us that, you know, how you're working on it at the committee, what you're trying to address, and maybe even some of the outcomes that you're trying to get out of your work?
Yeah, it has been a great session to get the fraud committee up and running. And I would say we're just beginning our work, honestly. So we had 3 kind of buckets of our work. One was to expose fraud. One was to provide leadership and understanding of where there are gaps in statute that we as the legislature could fix to give more tools for oversight in the agencies. And then the third one is to provide a place where the public could let us know about fraud that they've experienced, or as providers they've seen, or as state employees. This is really important. State employees can whistleblow. And so we created a fraud portal. It's called mnfraud.com. And so if people have things they want to get to the committee, you can just go on our website, mnfraud.com, and report in. And then we will eventually get to it. So the first week it was open, we had 530 reports. And since it opened, and I think end of March, early April, we're past 700. So literally during session, we didn't have a lot of time. And so now myself and a staff member are kind of working our way through those 700. But it's a lot of work, and we're just, so what happens is people send an email, we then kind of triage where we need to fit it in. And then we've started doing whistleblower interviews behind the scenes to, you know, a lot of people have reports and maybe they've had an experience that's not great with an agency, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's fraud. So we really have to drill down to the specifics. And so we're in the process of doing that. But to some of the things we got done. So first of all, we wanted to expose the fraud. So there's so many fraud stories, and Feeding Our Future is the big one that came out of the Department of Education.
Right.
But there are also many in the Department of Human Services. But then there are some in other areas, just grant programs in different areas that people have reported on. So we wanted to kind of start telling those stories and help the public understand all of it, and ourselves as members. We as members really had no idea the depth of this. And so that's been the first layer. And we actually haven't spent much time on Feeding Our Future because that's in process. Those court cases are underway. And we've tried to more look at some of the other areas of fraud. And so, you know, people have seen a lot of the news stories: sober homes, autism centers, peer-to-peer recovery specialists, non-emergency medical transportation, durable medical goods, residential care facilities. Like, in every area, there seems to be fraud, but what we've honed in on is that there really is a business model of fraud, and that's where most of the high dollar fraud has happened, and that's where we're trying to better understand the business model and then figure out gaps in statute where we can crack down.
That's great, and I really love the whistleblower aspect that you were talking about. When you think of something as big as the ones you're mentioning, somebody knows something.
Absolutely.
Maybe they're not being listened to, or maybe they're scared, but now that they have that opportunity, that's going to be absolutely huge, to be able to have that portal where they can enter the information and get it to somebody who is working on it. I think that's going to be just tremendous. It's interesting because a lot of those areas that you just mentioned, I just was reading about, the feds did a big crackdown too. It was 14.6 billion or something. And it was a lot of the same medical stuff that you were talking about. It seems like anytime you have big dollars involved, there's going to be that potential for fraud, and it's going to probably follow, like you said, kind of the same fraud business model. So I hate to hear that it's obviously going on in Minnesota as well, but I think, you have to be on the right track. Anytime you've got those avenues for abuse, within those medical ones in particular, I think that's really, that's going to be where there's a lot of action.
Right. And I think what we're seeing on some of these big dollar areas that I just listed off, a lot of it is in what we're calling the Medicaid expansion programs. So there's a lot of talk about Medicaid right now, and traditional Medicaid was for people with disabilities, elderly, pregnant women, and then low-income families, parents and children.
Right.
That's traditional Medicaid, and it was for acute health care and regular health care.
Right.
Primary care. But then after the ACA, there was all these expansion areas, and most of them are unregulated.
Right.
So a lot of these sober homes, residential care facilities, autism centers, they're not regulated by the feds or the state. And that's where fraudsters saw the opportunity to have a business model where, so kind of how it works is people see a huge pot of money in one of these areas and they set up a business to then bill Medicaid. And they're either fraudulently billing and not providing the services, or they're providing some substandard level of service or alternative like service, but it's not what they're billing for, or they're double billing.
Correct.
And then they layer on the other services that are also unregulated. So you could have a sober home or an autism center that also you start providing non-emergency transportation, or you provide interpretive services, or you provide the feeding. Some of the autism centers became Feeding Our Future sites. So they layer on all these ways to bill Medicaid. And because some of them even come through different agencies, it's not flagged. So one of the big reforms we got this year, that there was a lot of fraud earlier in the 2010s, and the state legislature before my service set up an Office of Grants Management.
Sure.
And that was supposed to help address this. And two of the reforms we got done this year is the Office of Grants Management has been offering training for how to do good grants management if you have that responsibility as an employee. But the training wasn't required. And we were stunned in these hearings to hear them say, oh, well, we have recommended the training, but people aren't taking the training. The state has put all this money into developing. So we passed language saying if you're a grants manager, you have to take the training. And not only do you have to take it, you have to successfully complete it. Because anyone can sit on a webinar and say, yeah, I took the training, but you have to show, that you actually mastered the material. And then the other thing we did is we are requiring that the Office of Grants Management set up a do not fund sort of category. So people have been flagged as fraud or a bad grants management or a fraudulent provider, because it's on the nonprofit, but it's also on the for-profit side. So if they're flagged for abuse in some way, then there will be a list that's maintained across state agencies. So before you give a grant, before you sign up with a provider, you can check this list. Have they been flagged somewhere? And I was honestly stunned to realize that wasn't happening, but that's one of the good reforms we got done.
I've always wondered about that when the legislature approves something like a grant program. I know there's some follow-up back by the legislative committees that are experts in that area, but I always wondered about how much gets back to that committee by way of kind of challenging whether the system is working right and determining whether the grants are ending up in the right people's hands and that sort of thing.
Right. Unfortunately, not enough.
Yeah.
So we have found legislative, there's this group called the Office of the Legislative Auditor.
Okay.
That has ability to go in and audit these programs. And they have been auditing some of these programs. I've seen reports from the early 2000s forward showing kind of the same issues, right, where it's not good internal controls. Yes. It's not closing out the contracts properly. It's not doing on-site visits or verifying that things are being done well or proper billing practices. So we have decades of these reports that then no one follows up on because committee chairs change, members change.
Priorities change.
Yes, and so now we're gonna try to centralize that. And one of the other reforms we got done this year is that it's called a fraud note. And this was done by Representative Jim Nash. And so what happens is we all get a fiscal note to kind of talk about the budget implications of a bill, but now we're going to get a fraud note that does on the front end risk analysis, and also requires that if there's been an OLA report on what their recommendations were to clean up an area. Have they implemented the OLA recommendations before we give more money? So hopefully that will make a big difference. So we've done a lot of meaningful reforms this year. In addition to the ones I've mentioned, we also strengthened whistleblower protections for state employees so that before it was just certain state employees who had whistleblower protection. Now we've expanded it to all state employees. We also created a state level crime of kickbacks. So this was one of the things where in the committee before this year, state agencies always had the ability to stop payments if there was credible allegations of fraud, but they didn't necessarily exercise that authority. And so one of the hearings, we went through some credible allegations of fraud that were kickbacks. And to me, that's sort of prima facie, credible allegation of fraud. But they said, well, we don't have a state crime of kickbacks. It's only a federal crime. So we're not stopping payments.
Sure.
So we're like, okay, we're creating a state crime of kickbacks. And the governor also supported that. So we had bipartisan support for that. And we got the state crime of kickbacks created, which I hope will help the agencies feel like they can have a stronger hand.
Sure. Well, and the audit thing is interesting too. Banking is one of the most heavily regulated industries. We do not get away with having a violation cited for failure to follow the right procedures and failure to have good corporate governance and all that stuff. One citation, you fix it. By the time they get it a second time, it's massive. The power that they have to come down and prevent that from happening. So I hope that auditor is able to, take control of those situations and make sure that they get addressed. That'll be really, really helpful.
Right. And that's one of the gaps that still exists. So to your point, if any of this was going on in the private sector, people would be in jail. Not only the providers who are getting prosecuted, say under Feeding Our Future, but the agency staff who allowed it to happen.
Right.
And that's where the disconnect has happened, because as the legislature, there's separation of powers. So we can't tell the executive branch to fire people, to stop payment, to do these things. And the legislative auditor, she's incredible, but she also has limited jurisdiction because she's a legislative agency.
Right.
And again, we can't get into the executive branch. So one of our big reform bills this year was creating an Office of Inspector General within the executive branch.
Perfect.
And it was really well done. We had a bipartisan, bicameral group working all session, and the governor initially supported it. But when the bill actually came down, it was strong. It had tremendous teeth, and then the governor and DHS in particular no longer supported it.
Yeah.
So we didn't get it over the finish line this year. But we need to get that bill done, and we are going back for it next year. So it passed the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats, 60-7. I mean, that's huge bipartisan support for really creating this institutional Office of Inspector General, and it died in the House, mostly because of the objections of the executive branch. And so we need to go back and get that done because of separation of powers, we're missing that piece in Minnesota, and most other states have a executive branch Office of Inspector General. And they argue, well, individual agencies have them. DHS has one, Department of Ed has one, but clearly they've had them and it hasn't worked. Yeah. So we need this overarching Office of Inspector General that has much more teeth. It can subpoena, it can fire people, it can have a lot more authority over executive branch agencies. And I do support that, and I hope we get that done this year.
60-7 is an incredible vote. Yeah. In a state like Minnesota that is so evenly split. Boy, I sure hope they can get that done. That would make a big difference.
Yeah, so help us next year. Call your legislators. Tell them we need to get this done.
That is really huge. That would be cool to see that one get through. That would be really helpful. So as you've been doing this work, is there anything that's kind of surprised you, or where, like you said, you thought that maybe there was more than you were even expecting, but what were some of the biggest surprises as you've been digging into that work?
There's been so many. I mean, a couple of things I mentioned, like that they didn't stop payment because there was no crime of kickbacks, even though it was a credible allegation of fraud, or some of the other things that the grants management training wasn't required. Like, I'm not a person who wants to micromanage in statute. And since they were given permissive authority, I would expect them to exercise it, but they weren't. Right. So now we've had to be much more explicit in statute, changing all the mays to musts.
Right.
So I was very surprised by that. The other thing I was very surprised about is how outdated the state technology is.
Oh, yeah.
And there are AI tools that can help with fraud detection, finding anomalies in payment systems or looking across agencies. And we are not using that at the state. A lot of the state sort of eligibility is one of the places where we find the problems.
Right.
And the state and the county systems for checking eligibility are like dots, like so old, and it takes so much time.
Yeah.
And we have so many more high-tech tools. So the legislature did invest $40 million to upgrade the technology to help with streamlining some of these payment systems and being able to use AI more effectively. Sure. So I hope that will make a difference, not only on the actual finding of fraud, but also for the agency employees. There are so many people who are working hard and want to do the right thing, and we need to give them the tools to make their jobs easier.
Absolutely. Bankers, if you have any questions that you want to ask of our guests today, go ahead and type that into your chat. Carla will be monitoring that. So if you have any questions, go ahead and send those to us. I think that's huge to get that technology done. Banks are kind of on the front line of stopping financial fraud, and we've been working on that. But even with really good systems in place, you know, some things still slip by the goalie. But they have invested a lot in those types of systems that you're talking about to make sure that fraud doesn't happen. And you know, when you look at cyber crimes and stuff like that, a lot of the biggest areas where you see it are banking and then healthcare. So those industries have been investing heavily in that. I wonder if there isn't a way that you could learn from what's going on in some of those industries. I know we'd be willing to help.
No, absolutely. As I said, I'd love to talk to some of your main fraud investigative teams and learn from them. And some of the departments are ahead of others. Like I think the Department of Revenue has a pretty robust system.
Sure.
So we are planning to spend time over the interim learning from private sector, learning from agencies that are doing it well, and trying to make sure that whatever we invest in, it works across the system. Because part of the problem is different agencies have already gone ahead and built different technology systems, right, and they don't necessarily talk to each other, which is why we're missing some of these flags.
Absolutely. Law enforcement has gone through that in the past as they were looking for criminals. Poor sharing of information that would be really helpful to another agency back in the day. Now they've gone leaps and bounds doing a better job of sharing information. If they're seeing a pattern here, what could be going on over here in the same in the same space. So law enforcement has figured out how to do it, and I'm hoping the agencies can do that as well. That'd be really, really helpful to get that done.
Joe, before you go on, we do have a question.
Excellent.
Terry would like to know, does the committee have a general idea of the amount of fraud in Minnesota?
I would say it's hundreds of millions. So there's a group out there called Center of the American Experiment that has a fraud tracker, and we had them come in and testify. And they've identified about 610 million to date, just from, say, like pre-COVID 2018 forward. And I'm sure it's much higher than that, because some, like Feeding Our Future was $250 million of fraud, but there were two other cases that aren't as well known that were also about 250 million that were settled out of court. And so, and that's just in that area. And we've identified all these other areas. So I'm sure it's well north of $1 billion. But we're being careful. Like, we don't want to make allegations that we can't back up. So, but I would say we'll be well north of $1 billion.
Wow. Yeah, I guess those numbers aren't that surprising. Again, with what we've seen at the federal level in some of those areas, that one massive ring that they busted was 14 billion or something like that. So we know it's out there. We shouldn't be surprised, but it's still painful to see those kind of numbers in a state like Minnesota. That we just can't afford to lose that kind of money.
Exactly. Taxpayers are so frustrated because Minnesotans don't mind paying their taxes, right, when they know it's being well spent. But when they see it going, I mean, the list of things that these fraudsters have spent the money on that we haven't been able to recover much of.
Right.
And so, this one person bought a $2.6 $7 million mansion on Park Avenue in Minneapolis. Another guy bought property in Kenya and Turkey. And he also, interestingly, bought a $2.4 million culinary school in Ohio. Like, this is where our tax money is going, right? And fancy cars and all the things, right? So Minnesotans are frustrated, like, we need to get a handle on this. We cannot let our money that's supposed to be going to needy citizens who really need services be absconded like that.
Yeah, that's incredible.
There is another question. Is your committee looking only at government fraud, or are you reviewing private sector fraud such as the banking industry?
So we are only looking at money involving state agencies and state tax dollars. But the Attorney General, as I'm sure many bankers know, has a robust consumer fraud division, and that is, still going to be the avenue for consumer fraud.
Yeah, and just a reminder that we've been working closely with the State Department of Commerce as well. They've had fraud investigators, and I think some of them have moved to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, but they're still there. And we've had good relationships with the department as well as the BCA. So if any bankers are looking for help on specific fraud items, there is help for them as well, just not this particular avenue.
Exactly, no, but the commerce fraud investigators have been fantastic, and for trying to get rid of silos, the governor did propose moving everything into the BCA under Drew Evans, and I do think they all are great at their jobs. There's been some back and forth about whether taking the commerce people over there and kind of making that move is the right decision. I just don't have any expertise, but they're the same people and they do great work, so.
Absolutely. Yeah, make sure you're taking advantage of that if you need some help. So I see we're bumping up against the end. Do you have any last words for us? Anything that we didn't get to yet that you maybe wanted to cover with these folks?
I just want to give people hope. Like, this is a huge problem, and I do think we're just at the beginning, but we are, now that the fraud committee is up and running, I think we will continue to keep our eye on the ball and make sure that across state agencies, we are not losing sight of the big picture and dealing with fraud across the state government, because we want to clean it up for our taxpayers and for the citizens who need the help. And also, I would say, stay tuned. The fraud committee is not stopping our work. So most committees don't meet during the interim, but we had a meeting in July on Medicaid fraud, and we are teeing up meetings for September, October, November, and possibly early December, and then January. We don't go back into session till February in 2026. So we are not going to stop all the work.
Well, that's fantastic. Keep up the good work. Thank you again for joining me, and bankers, thanks for tuning into this program, and I hope you all have a great day.